We are working on ACT English. We're going to do 23 points today out of 36. Then week 6, we're going to be doing 8 points. And finally, week 7, we're going to finish up with the final 5 points. All of this is laid out really strategically, but for every single question, you're actually going to be using the same method. So we're going to go ahead and put the method over here so that you can have it throughout our lesson. You want to read it until you have enough info to identify a possible error, which means you're not going to read through the entire passage. In the English section, you have 75 questions in only 45 minutes. So what you're going to do is you're going to take a look at those 75 questions as they're laid out. There are 5 separate essays, and you want to think about it as if you're peer reviewing something. So these essays aren't perfect. By any means, they are not perfect. So you're going to be looking for any errors or organizational issues that they have. So think about it as if you're sitting in English class and this is your assignment. Once you have read until you find a possible error, then stop to answer the question. So don't read the entire essay and then go back. There are 15 questions for each essay, and there are 5 essays. Once you look at the answer choices, you are actually going to be eliminating anything that's immediately not going to address the error. Get rid of anything that you know isn't going to fix it. And then you're going to use these 3 helpful words: correct, concise, and clear. Concise actually means short. So we're going to show you with questions today how going to the shortest answer choice can be really helpful. When we talk about eliminating answer choices that don't address the issue, if you know that there's a grammatical error, you can get rid of answer choice A a lot of the time. For every question, but for a lot of the questions, the answer choice A is no change. But if there's an error, there has to be a change. So this method is going to come into play for every question that you see, and we're going to show you how to use it when you're looking at particular topics. All these question types are sprinkled throughout the test. So it's not like you're going to have 7 points worth of conjunctions, transitions, and independent clauses right off the bat. They're going to be sprinkled throughout, although we can tell you with writing strategy and organization, those usually come towards the end of the essays. So the last couple of questions are going to ask you about paragraphs and adding information or deleting information. For everything else, though, you're going to find them everywhere. So for your practice this week, you are going to be looking at the essays as a whole, but you're really going to be concentrating on 4 specific things. Our strategic focus for this week are foundational concepts, and they're actually big point makers or point getters. You are going to have 23 points that are focused in connections, verb tenses, wordiness, and punctuation. So we're going to go through all of those types of questions so you can check out what you're supposed to be looking for. So as you're practicing this week, we don't expect you to be getting perfect 36s. We're looking specifically at 23 points that you're going to want to get as a foundation before we start adding on. For connections, the biggest thing to keep in mind is that not only do things have to be grammatically correct, but also they have to be logical. So this isn't just a straightforward grammar test. As you're reading these essays, you actually have to be looking out for the main idea. You're looking out for any transitions that they have. So if you've taken an ACT English section before, you might be doing something that you need to immediately change. You may be skipping around. You do not want to skip any sentences. You may think that it will speed you up, but it's actually going to slow you down in the long run. Even if a sentence doesn't have an underlined portion, don't skip over it. We cannot emphasize that enough because you're going to wind up missing out on points within this connections subject, but also you're going to be missing out on points when it comes to writing strategy and organization. If you don't know what the author said entirely, you're going to have a really hard time organizing what the author said. So your mission, and we'll show you your mission in terms of homework, but your current mission, should you choose to accept it, is to not skip around. You're actually going to make it a lot harder for yourself if you're not reading the entire essay. So think about the essay as if a peer wrote it, so someone in your class, and don't skip over anything. That way you can be sure that you have correct sentence and paragraph transitions. For independent and dependent clauses, the only way you're going to figure out how they're affected is if you're reading everything. And then in terms of conjunctions, you may have reinforcement, contrast, cause and effect, or sequence. And the best way to show you this is actually with sample questions. So the first sentence here, and actually both sentences that start off this paragraph, there's no underlines. So should you just read The Shield of Alexander the Great, on the other hand, just start off with the third sentence? Please don't do that. You're going to wind up missing a point right off the bat. So here, you're going to read that first sentence, the second sentence, and the third sentence. So go ahead and pause the video to read those 3 sentences, and only those 3 sentences. Now that you've read those 3 sentences, it should be a lot clearer that the shield of Alexander the Great is an example of the images. The word abounded means that they were everywhere. So this is an example, correct answer is C, of the images of Medusa. Had you not read the first and second sentences, that would have been a really difficult question to answer. So don't skip around. Lesson number 1, right there, an example. Now the next sentence has underlined portions. You don't want to stop at the word beauty. Since the underlined portion is 2 sentences together, make sure you read all of both sentences. So go ahead and do that now. Now, once you've read those 2 sentences, you get to figure out if there is an error. Out of these questions, about 25% of the time, there's going to be no error. And there's no error here. There is correct punctuation. And the other thing that they're asking you about is if it should be also or however. Also is a continuation, however is a contrast. So I would think that lovely hair into snakes, not so beautiful. Very hard to shampoo. So you're going to be looking for a contrast. The word however does that perfectly, and you don't want to change it to a comma. We'll actually talk about punctuation in a little bit. Then you have another sentence with no underline. Don't skip it. So go ahead and read the last 2 sentences. Now that you've read the last 2 sentences, you need to figure out what type of transition you need. Is it a continuation, an example, cause and effect, or contrast? What you're looking for here is contrast. Answer choice B is correct. So your connections, those 7 points, are only possible if you know what the author is talking about. Do not skip sentences, even if there's no underline. Use that as your takeaway, and you're going to get more points. On to verb tenses. There are 6 different types of tenses that the test will cover. So present, past, future, present perfect, past perfect, and future perfect. Now, the good news is you don't have to label them. You just have to know whether or not they're correct. So let's check out some questions. Don't skip over that first sentence. Read the first and second sentences. Now that you've read through the first and second sentences, the second sentence is, almost all of the available space being crammed with old books or covered with folios. If that sounded wrong, I am very glad to hear that. You're going to get rid of answer choice A. Now, the easiest thing to do is to go to the shortest answer choice and try that out. So, almost all of the available space crammed with. That's not going to work. So, cross off answer choice D. Try answer choice C. Almost all of the available space is crammed with old books or. Now, that's very similar to answer choice B. If you plug in answer choice B, almost all of the available space was crammed with old books or is covered. Well, that's a problem. That's not parallel. So even if you're not sure if present tense is the correct way to do that, you know that answer choice B, first of all, it's longer than answer choice C, so that's your first indication it might not be correct. They really do like conciseness, but also there's not parallelism. So even if you're not sure 100% should it be present tense or past tense, well, you've gotten rid of everything else. So once you've eliminated everything, eliminating 3 wrong answers is the same thing as finding 1 right answer. So you don't have to be a grammar expert. You just want to be a really good test taker and know a lot about the test. Don't skip the next sentence, so read the last 2 sentences there. Now that you've read those 2 sentences, what's really nice about this is a lot of students are wary about apostrophes, and we'll actually talk about those. But they're not actually asking you about the apostrophe. Take a look. In all versions, the apostrophe is the same, so that's not the problem. We need to make sure that the verb is correct. What was initially a hobby quickly became a life's passion and devotion. So first of all, think, does that sound okay? It may be correct as written. And then check out the other answer choices. Quickly was becoming, quickly will become, or quickly becomes. When you're thinking about changing things, you want to stick with the original unless there's a specific reason why it's wrong. So keep that in mind. We've learned some really valuable things. First of all, don't skip over things. Secondly, they really like conciseness. Third, getting rid of 3 wrong answer choices is the same thing as finding 1 right answer choice. And here, this one, the takeaway for this one is, do not alter what they originally said unless you have a very specific reason why. Continuing with this passage, we want to check out the next verbs. So this one, you just have to read the first sentence. Now that you've read the first sentence, this is a really tricky one. So we're going to pause here to make sure that we hone in on this particular concept. There is what we call an appositive. So several papers in Dr. Gregory's collection is signed. Several papers, that's more than one. So rather than is, you need are. Several papers in Dr. Gregory's collection are signed by John Hancock. It's a really tough one to pick up on. They really like this question. You will see one like this on test day. And what they're doing is they're separating the subject and the verb with something in the way, either a prepositional phrase or in this case, an appositive. An appositive is non-essential information in between two commas. So for this one, it's really tough, and they're not even asking about past tense or present tense. They're asking whether or not it's singular or plural. So when you take a look at this type of question, you can actually take your pencil and cross off that appositive. As long as it doesn't have any underlined information, then just get rid of it and be able to focus on subject and verb. Now that you've done that one, go ahead and read the next sentence. Since they are currently proudly displayed, it's going to be present tense. And that's something you'll find throughout this paragraph. They're talking a lot about present tense. So represent, are, if we go back to the other ones, we have is crammed. So we have present tense. You want to keep it in consistent verb form if at all possible. So we have 3 is be, 4 is G. So verb tenses actually just take a little bit of practice. They're not going to try to throw anything at you that's really strange. They are trying to test whether or not you can peer review and if you can pick out verb tense issues. These are really fun because you can generally pick up these 5 points just by going to that shortest answer choice and seeing if it works. If you find that the shortest answer choice doesn't fix the error, then you're going to go to the next shortest answer choice. The other thing you want to know how to do is how to use the omit the underlined portion option. And then the final thing, in terms of information that isn't relevant to the passage, make sure that you're not keeping stuff in the passage or adding things to the passage that don't have anything to do with what the author was talking about. That's something they really don't like. Don't add in stuff that doesn't make any sense. So for this particular passage, we have omit the underlined portion as options for both of our questions. You could skip that first sentence, and second sentence, but we really want you to not be skipping anything that you should be looking at. And here these are labeled 4 and 5, but we labeled them as 1 and 2. They're from the first part of a passage. So question number 4 lines up with number 1. Question number 5 lines up with number 2. Okay, so go ahead and read the first 3 sentences. Now that you've read the first 3 sentences, they give us the year 1890 right here. So there's a couple of things wrong. First, it's kind of insulting if they think we can't do math. So there's that. And secondly, we don't want to add anything that doesn't further the author's message by saying this was over 100 years ago. The author already told us it was in 1890, so that's going to be over 100 years ago. So we want to actually get rid of it. That didn't really help us out. Now for the next one, go ahead and read the last sentence there. Now, one of the fun things to do, especially if it's a short phrase, is check to see if that information is located anywhere else. They tell us as a young girl. As a young girl and at an early age, same thing. So get rid of anything that's directly stated somewhere else. We don't have an example of something that's unrelated to the passage, but looking at what you read here, If we wanted to add in anything about how she wore her hair, Christy liked to wear her hair short to keep herself cool in the summertime. Oh my goodness. First of all, it makes her sound a little bit like a dog, because we like to cut dogs' hair short at the rescue I work at so that they stay cool during the summertime, so that's not great. And secondly, it doesn't have anything to do with what they're talking about. So keep in mind, wordiness in general, you're going to omit the underlined portion. In fact, omit the underlined portion is correct 9 times out of 10. On to punctuation. For punctuation, there are 4 things that you need to know, starting with commas. So these are your 5 options. You can use a comma to separate items in a series or list, set off non-essential info, that's called in a positive, set off intro phrases, separate 2 independent clauses linked with a fan voice word. And actually, let's go ahead and write that out for you. And then your final option is separate an independent and dependent clause. Here we go. And actually, unfortunately, I wrote it out not in order. So I wrote out fanoibs. Let me fix that. It still works. Those are all the words. It's just not in the right order. Okay, there we go. So here, fanoibs, there. Those are coordinating conjunctions that you can separate with a comma. You can separate 2 independent clauses. So you have an example here. Fanboys words are coordinating conjunctions, comma, and they are important to memorize for test day. So we have your uses and we have your examples. So look over this chart, check to see if some of these look unfamiliar, and then as you're practicing this week, be on the lookout for when they take fanboys, or if they're just doing commas, if they have items in a series or a list, try to identify where these are being used, and that way you can reinforce the concepts that you're learning here. For semicolons, I actually really like semicolons. You can think of them as periods. For the first use right there, if you can put a period and a capital letter where the semicolon used to be, then it's being used correctly. Semicolons and commas are not interchangeable. They are not the same thing. Don't let anybody tell you that. No, they're not. They're not. They're not. Semicolons are like periods. They separate 2 independent clauses. Now, the thing that you may see on the test, they don't always test it, and you'll only see it once if it is tested, is if you have items in a list that already have commas in them. In this case, one way to think of this is if you're doing math and you have a lot of parentheses, you might wind up using brackets as well to separate the bigger things. So that's what is being used here. The commas are like parentheses in math, and the semicolons are like brackets. So it's a good way to remember that. And then in terms of colons, these just check to see if it's setting something apart, like a question, an explanation, an example, or a list. And you can't see it right there, but there is a comma in between the word question and explanation, just so that you know that it just didn't show up on the slide for some reason. So there's a comma. We try to be as grammatically correct as possible, so there's a comma there. As long as you see that it's being used to set something off in terms of colons, then it's going to be used correctly. And that one just takes a little bit of practice since you don't see that every day. Dashes are interesting. They are very rarely wrong. So be careful before you start saying that a dash is wrong, because they can be used as commas or as semicolons. So the first example, Eleanor Roosevelt, a revered, meaning respected, first lady, influenced her husband's political decisions. That's basically 2 commas. The next one, the stylist gave me a terrible haircut. I think I'll hide until my hair grows back. That one, those are 2 separate sentences. So dashes usually are used correctly. It's really hard to find a way they're not being used correctly unless they're in a really weird spot. For apostrophes, you're going to want to memorize some of the harder contractions and possessives. And the reason is because they like to check to see if you've studied, basically. So you're going to see contractions and possessive forms that you may not have seen before. So studying those ahead of time is going to be really helpful. So for the possessive, the puppies floppy ears. So the puppy has his floppy ears, and then the puppy cannot stop wiggling because they're adorable. So let's do some questions. We have our first sentence, which does have an underline. Go ahead and read that. And this is really interesting. The comma isn't necessarily wrong, but you can't fix anything that's not underlined, and you already have a dash. So you're going to have to be parallel here. You need another dash. So that in that way, the dash is being used as a comma. It's being used to show an appositive. Now go ahead and read the second sentence. Now that you've read the second sentence, you see that a semicolon is underlined, so check to see if you have two independent clauses. In contrast to my expectations, the audience wasn't made up of retirees and studious types. Is that an independent clause? Subject, verb, complete thought? Yep. There were young people on dates, families with small children, and groups of friends. Is that an independent clause? That's actually quite complex. It has items in a series. That's a full sentence, or what we call an independent clause. So that semicolon is 100% correct. Now the question is saying, which of the following options to replace the underlined portion would not be acceptable? Okay, well, can a dash be used as a period or a semicolon? Yep. What about, and that should be G, it showed up as D, should be G. What about if we don't have anything? Is that going to be allowed? I'm not sure, let's check everything else. Can we have a period separating independent clauses? Mm-hmm. What about a semicolon in the word instead? Instead, there were. That's also allowed. Not having any choice at all, and we can click that one and know not only is that option wrong, but it should be answer choice G as well. Okay, question number 3. Go ahead and read that one, and we're looking to see how that apostrophe is being used. So they're checking to see if there should be an apostrophe, if the apostrophe is in the right spot, and if there should be a comma. So that's a whole bunch of stuff. Well, let's see, are there any contractions? So the musician is tuned. That wouldn't make sense, or that could be the musician singular. Is there any possession going on? If there's no possession, then answer choice A and answer choice C don't make any sense whatsoever. B and D are then left. So there's no possession, but should there be a comma? As the sun began to set, the musicians, comma, tuned their instruments. What would the comma even be doing? It's not in a positive. It's not setting off an intro phrase. So there really shouldn't be a comma. So no apostrophe, no comma, answer choice B, and done. Ta-da! Beautiful punctuation practice. The only way you're going to get comfortable with all of this, though, is actually to practice everything. So you're going to be looking for transition questions. You're going to be checking to make sure you're looking at independent and dependent clauses and conjunctions. Make sure you're on the lookout for verb tenses, wordiness, and punctuation for a total of 23 points. The easiest thing to do, go right to Grocket and complete the first 10 of your 15 segments. That is going to get in 2 practice tests worth of practice. So rather than having you jump around and look only at certain sections and do just particular question types, you're actually going to benefit more from doing full essays and actually full practice tests worth of practice. Because what we're going to be building on requires you to read the entire passage, we want you to get used to it. We have so many students who in the past skipped around. So that's what our goal is, for you to read entire essays and not skip anything, because you're going to need it for when we look at other question types in week 6 and week 7. So be very careful not to skip over anything. Do the first 10 of the 15 segments, save 5 for later, and there's actually more questions beyond this study plan in case you want extra practice. You can also just join a group game, and as you're working in your group game, just keep track of how many passages you all get through together. You may find that after 3 passages you're done and you want to leave the session. You may find that you want to work together for 5 passages, or if you're on a roll, you may find you knock out those 10 passages before you know it. So however long you want to study, that's absolutely fine, but you may find you're more motivated if you're studying with other students. So look for the little dog, Taco Pete, and those are the games that I set up for you. And then if you prefer to work on paper, of course that's fine. You can do 2 practice tests worth. There are 75 questions in each, which is 5 passages in each. So in all, everyone working, whether you're working in the Red Book, doing your study plan and or doing group games, you should complete 150 questions. It sounds like a lot, but it's going to fly by because you're going to be reading everything in those passages.